Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film Pete's Dragon from 1977. Pete's Dragon comes along in the history of Walt Disney Studios at a time when live-action films were not really working out for them as much as they used to. The animated films were, in the 70s, you had Robin Hood, you had The Rescuers. You had a lot of stuff that was doing quite well and is still very well received. But you had a lot of films that didn't really take off as much. You had a lot of Herbie films. You had stuff that just really didn't take as well as maybe they thought it would. And trying to do kind of the same formula that they were used to. And Pete's Dragon fits perfectly into that time. It was considered, at least when it was the beginning of development, to be kind of a follow-up to Mary Poppins. Walt Disney Studios kept trying to make Mary Poppins-like films, particularly like Bedknobs and Broomsticks, which I quite like. Pete's Dragon is very much in the tradition of that, but it's probably the last time they tried to make one of those films. And although it wasn't a huge hit really, it did fine at the time, but because of Disney's penchant to re-release things over and over and over again, and then it was actually the first Disney film released on home video, although not for sale for too many people, and I've talked to so many people who said it was like the only film they could rent when video stores started opening. So I think that kind of made this film a little bigger than it initially was in 1977. And it kind of shows the end of a certain era at the time that a whole new era was beginning. This film did come out in 1977, and if you don't know your film history, Star Wars happened that year, and it kind of overpowered everything, including most kids' imaginations. And I think Pete's Dragon didn't really survive that transition. Now, that's not really Disney's fault. No one really knew Star Wars was going to be what it was, and it kind of was the beginning of Disney trying to figure out what to do with a family audience as the teen market kind of took over the box office in the late 70s and early 80s, and didn't really want much to do with Disney films, which they saw as kind of inferior and childish. And since also it was the baby bust, so not as many babies were being born yet, and the baby boomers kids wouldn't be born and be able to see movies until the mid to late 80s, Disney was going through not the greatest time to make family films. But I also think Pete's Dragon maybe isn't up to snuff for their other films. It's an enjoyable kids film when you're a kid, but as an adult, it's really long. It's kind of showing the end of doing big studio musicals with big stars in them and making this kind of grand old classic Hollywood tradition thing that was very much going out and why it went out. But it also has amazing animation by Don Bluth of Elliot the Dragon, Pete's Dragon, and it definitely shows Disney's technical mastery and how, entertaining a musical kind of film like this could be, but also the faults in it and how a lot of these films, like Mary Poppins, have a complete nonsensical flow and scripts that don't really work out as well. And although Mary Poppins is a definite classic and no one's going to argue with it, it's not the kind of thing you should base other movies on, because it was kind of a miracle that film turned out as well as it did, considering how many different odd things that go on with it. And Pete's Dragon definitely does not work with that kind of a flow, and it's kind of a casualty of a studio trying to live up to a film that it's almost impossible and a once-in-a-lifetime thing and that can't really be recaptured. A boy named Pete, who is fleeing his abusive hillbilly foster family, the Gogans, who have bought him and have a bill of sale or something, and he's running away and they can't find him, and he runs away to Passamaquoddy with his dragon Elliot, who is invisible most of the time but can appear sometimes, and he's there in town and meets up with a nice woman, Nora, and Nora takes him in, as well as Lampy, played by Mickey Rooney. Pete and his mischievous dragon Elliot cause various things around town, and then a medicine show doctor comes to town and figures out that Elliot is not a fake dragon but a real dragon who can be invisible, and wants to try to capture him, and gets involved with the Gogans so they can get Pete and he can get Elliot, as Pete and his dragon Elliot are trying to find a good home in Passamaquoddy with Nora and Lampy, and hopefully live in the lighthouse as a family and finally have a home. Everyone I talked to who was a kid when this movie came out, I wasn't born when this came out, but anyone I knew who was a kid when this came out, I mentioned like, hey, I'm just curious, what was the reception when Pete's Dragon came out? And almost everyone went, well, I know I saw it, but what year was that? And I go, that's 77, that's the year of Star Wars. And they go, oh shit, yeah, I think I was just thinking about Star Wars. It kind of took over, and it was like these years of Disney making things like Tron and Black Hole, because they knew they were kind of missing a market, and they were kind of looked at as old hat. And as this film had come out after the huge success of Star Wars, and Star Wars in 77 was definitely still playing in theaters, even though this film very masterfully mixes animation with stop motion, animation and live action very well, it just doesn't feel new. It feels like something we've seen before. Maybe that's why they decided to remake it as a drama rather than do this, because this Disney trying to recapture a formula again and again wasn't something people were as into, and since their declining box office of their live action films at the time, this probably didn't help perceptions. Apparently it did fine. It wasn't like a disaster or something. It just didn't really capture a lot of people's hearts because hearts were taken by Star Wars, basically. This kind of was the beginning of them trying to capture a teen market. I mean, you could trace the effects of this all the way to like Black Cauldron. They wouldn't really get themselves out of it until about 10 to 12 years later with Little Mermaid. But Pete's Dragon, nonetheless, is still, it shows how they can put on a show, certainly with the direction of Don Chaffee, who also directed 1 Million BC and Jason and the Argonauts, and he definitely knew how to work with special effects very well, and I think he did a very good job on Pete's Dragon, kind of almost like a very studio director job, not like an interesting studio director job, like a cooler 70s studio director, kind of a super lame studio director, but he does a good job with it, and the parts with Pete and the dragon are really the standouts. If someone could make a cut of all those scenes, I would much rather watch that. The biggest problem with this film is it's incredibly long. The original Roadshow release of this film was 134 minutes, but the DVD release I saw was like 124 minutes, and there's been all sorts of different cuts of it. But regardless, it is far too long. There's far too many details, far too many character arcs, far too many things going on within it, and it doesn't really understand maybe both what the target audience would like, but also, you know, it's called Pete's Dragon, not Nora's Sad About This Guy Who's Lost at Sea movie, or whatever they would have called it, I guess. Or like Lampy's whole thing, and then like having a whole musical sequence in a bar, and a lot of things that like look like they were really cool to stage, and if I had like been there, they'd be awesome, but I don't think had much of a point in the movie. And Pete's Dragon has a lot of that. It has a lot of like side tangents and things like that, and I think Mary Poppins and Bedknobs and Broomsticks, they do a lot of that stuff and it works for it. And Pete's Dragon, it really didn't, but I think also a lot of those things were fantastical tone changes. In this, they tried to just do different elements of the characters that in theory that could be cool and could actually work, but it doesn't, because you're just kind of going off on all these different odd directions. I think the villain thing doesn't entirely work. I kind of almost understand trying to capture the dragon and put him in a zoo or something, but chopping him up, the Dr. Terminus stuff, I really didn't think worked at all, and I really didn't like that character. But this feels so much like a kid's wacky Disney kind of kids film, and those parts kind of wore on me. I'm fine with watching a kids film, clearly, and that part doesn't bother me, but it really did feel like I was watching something that a kid would like a lot more. I have to say, I don't have a lot of nostalgia for this movie. There's a lot of Disney animated films I do. I never really got as into the Disney live action films, other than Mary Poppins, of course, which I guess is why they wanted to recapture that. But I don't have nostalgia for this. I remember the cave, like very distinctly, that cave on the water where Elliot the dragon was, but I don't remember the rest of the movie, and I remember kind of being fine with it, but it wasn't like a movie that was in my regular constant rotation. I do think it is like overly long, and I wish they'd maybe made it on a studio rather than made it kind of an outdoors kind of set, which a lot of musicals in the 70s try to do, and I just don't. I prefer musicals on sets. On location musicals, I mean, Sound of Music gets it to work, but I think it's often doesn't really work as well, because musicals don't need to be natural. They're by definition not. And it's interesting, something like, you know, All That Jazz, which is very much done in a studio and very much labored over and cut together, and trying to do kind of this more naturalistic thing in the seaside town. I also don't really understand why it takes place in the early 1900s. Like, what's the point of that? Is it trying to say something, or did you just pick that? It just seems like kind of a random decision. It doesn't really seem like it has much to do with anything, just to have sets and things. This film probably would have worked a little better in a 70s setting. So a lot of this film does feel outdated, and you're probably thinking like, oh, well, you're letting the idea of the 1977 and Star Wars overpower your opinion or something. But I can also see this in the context of the times, and reading the history of it after I saw it, I kind of went, well, it kind of makes sense to me. There's certain films that don't need to appeal to their times, but I think Pete's Dragon is a film that was very much behind the times and feels it. One thing though, the animation in this film is really great. The animation was done by Don Bluth and a few other animators, and they're very overworked. They weren't treated very well by Disney. They worked a lot of overtime. According to them, they worked about 100 hours a week, which I don't really want to think about what that meant per day or anything like that, because I'll probably cry or something. But because of that, they went to their boss to talk about overtime pay, and they said, how about this? For every hour you work overtime, you get an hour off later, like an hour paid leave vacation, and they ended up with 6 weeks. So fuck, that's a lot. That's like not good. But before you get too sad about that, because of that, Don Bluth was able to make, during that 6 weeks of continuous time off, him and Gary Goldman and John Pormeray, who worked on Pete's Dragon, or the animation part, got to work on their own private project called Banjo the Woodpile Cat, which let Don Bluth be a lot more looser and not be so constrained by the Disney animation machine, and ended up forming his own studio. So Pete's Dragon, if nothing else, started Don Bluth's whole animation studio and created Banjo the Woodpile Cat. So Disney's abuse of power did something good. That's cool. I think this is probably more memorable because of the idea of, when you're a kid, of having this imaginary dragon who will do anything you want, who will help you out if you are in need. And I remember the idea of that, and all the parts with the kid and the dragon are excellent, and even the parts with the kid, it just has too many other things going on and spends probably way too much time on them. This film definitely needs to be condensed. Apparently on TV there's like a 90-minute version. I kind of wish I had seen that, or could review it as a kid. Maybe I'd be a little more favorable, but I kind of almost understand remaking this, because I think there's a lot of things they kind of didn't do right and could have made a better film and still made a Disney film. But I think the 1900 setting just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. The music, I don't love the musical at all. I love the animation in it. I think it's really well done, even though, you know, it's not as great as like the Roger Rabbit animation that would be done later, but it's still pretty damn good. And the interaction, the actors really work with the animation, and I don't know how exactly they did that. Some of it's a little not perfect, but I still think it blends very well together. I was quite impressed with it, especially for the time period. I don't watch every movie and go, well, Star Wars was better, but I think the reason this film kind of got most of its love was from the VHS release, was from various re-releases. If you're ever surprised to later hear a Disney movie bomb, that's how they used to make sure all their movies made money, is they gave them significant video releases or re-releases later, and they would make money back on them somehow. Like Pinocchio, for example, or Fantasia were not hits when they came out, but through re-releases they were. And Pete's Dragon very much favored that. I love parts of Pete's Dragon a lot, but then there are other parts where I was like, oh my god, how long is this thing? And particularly like the Nora stuff, although I love the actress Helen Reedy, I thought she was really good. I like seeing Mickey Rooney. I like the kid in it. I liked Red Buttons and Jim Dale. I liked all the actors in it. I just didn't think overall it just felt very like kiddish and a little fake and a little overdone and a little overlong and just too much. And I would have liked a much more condensed movie and more about Pete and his dragon, like, you know, the titular Pete and his titular dragon. I would have liked that. And I think this film kind of got too obsessed with doing the model where they're trying to do all these different things and ended up not making a movie about what they should have been making a movie about. And I think it's a good premise. I think it's a good concept. I think the animation in Pete's Dragon works, but a lot of the movie around it just isn't as exciting and interesting, and I kind of wish the movie around it was, because the thing about Mary Poppins is she's a great character, but she's also surrounded by a great movie. I don't think Pete or Elliot the Dragon are surrounded by a great movie. They're surrounded by kind of like a very well made, kind of subpar, kind of very kiddie musical, but those are the parts that kids love, and I can understand why those parts have lived on, even if they're sandwiched in between a very subpar, very kiddie musical. So if you have seen Pete's Dragon and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. And actually, this movie was selected to go in the movie review raffle, but I knew I was going to do it already, and it was selected by Daniel Leon. Sometimes that happens if I plan on doing a movie. I disqualify it, but I'm still giving him credit, giving me the extra push to do that. So thank you, Daniel Leon, one of my very nice patrons on my Patreon. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.